I stood in front of the door, thinking about my life. I am 67 years old, married to the love of my life, and have two wonderful children, as well as 5 grandchildren. My life was as good as it could be. My wife Maggie has been a saint throughout our marriage. She stayed at home and took care of the children and the house, and never had a complaint from her. I have stood in front of this door many times, sometimes in anger, sometimes in horror, sometimes in anxiety, wondering what's ahead. I just never know what's going to happen. It was eerily quiet when I crossed the threshold. Then I heard the inevitable. Everyone stand up. The Honorable Judge Jeffrey Stone is here. I walked over to my bench, which overlooked the rest of the room. He looked around the room. A man and his lawyer on one side, a woman and her lawyer on the other, court stenographer, bailiff, and secretary. "Sit down," I said, taking my place. I looked at the file in front of me and turned it over, reading the information it contained. It looks like the husband is seeking a divorce. "Your Honor, the case is Sullivan versus Sullivan," the clerk said. I looked up at the assembled people. "Okay, Mr. Sullivan, you are seeking a divorce based on irreconcilable differences, with a division of property in a ratio of 50 to 50, as well as joint custody of minor children. This is true?" Mr. Sullivan leaned forward into the microphone on the table and said, "That's right, Your Honor." I looked at the opposite side. "Mr. Snyder, does your client agree to these terms?" He stood up and said, "No, Your Honor, she does not want a divorce and wants to see a psychologist to try to reconcile and save the marriage." I looked at both sides. Mr. Sullivan was whispering something to his lawyer. "I am inclined to agree that counseling is necessary, since I am all for saving any marriage, if at all possible." Mr. Sullivan's lawyer stood up and said, "Your Honor, at this time we want to withdraw the petition for divorce." "Well, I've never seen anything work out so well, so quickly. However, if this is what you desire, then the case is closed." I hit it with a hammer. The wife stood smiling. She went to her husband to hug him, but he completely ignored her and simply left the room. She stood stunned and began to cry. I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time I'd see these two. I returned to my chambers and plopped down in a chair. On my desk was a photograph of my wife and children when they were younger. I took it and looked at her. They were so young and innocent. It makes me sad to see that people like these two who have children have to go through something so difficult. I picked up the phone and dialed my daughter's number. After several rings, she answered. "Hi, honey, I'm just calling to see how you're doing." "Hey, Dad, I think I'm fine. What about you?" "I'm fine, dear, but from your voice it doesn't seem like you're fine. What's going on with you?" She sighed and began to sob a little. "Oh, Daddy, Michael and I have problems. I think we may end up getting a divorce. He's been so distant lately. I have a lot of work and no free time at all. I do not know what to do." "I'm sorry to hear that, honey. Have you tried talking to him? Perhaps you should see a psychologist. Marriage takes a lot of work. It's not something you can just sit back and hope things work out. Just look at Mom and me. We had a lot of ups and downs, but we never went far because we worked on our communication every day. You need to tell him how you feel. You have to make him understand. I know, Dad. You and your mother are the most wonderful parents anyone could ask for. I tried to talk to him, but he just doesn't seem to want to listen," she said. "Then make him listen. Do everything possible for this. Do not give up. Write it in a letter or email. No matter what it takes, you need to make him listen and understand how you feel." "Okay, Dad. I'll try to do it. Thank you for listening to me. I felt a little better. You always know how to make my day better. I love you, Dad. I love you madly, darling. Call me if you need anything." A week later, I stood in front of those doors again, and a feeling of anxiety arose in me. I had a feeling it was going to be a hard day. I entered. "Everyone rise. The Honorable Judge Jeffrey Stone is here." I went to my bench and sat down. "Take a seat." I looked at the people, and sure enough, they came back again. I looked at the case file, opening it. Divorce due to adultery. Well, the situation escalated quite quickly. Well, this is New York after all. You can do it as long as there's evidence. So, I see we're back again. "Mr. Sullivan, divorce due to adultery. I assume, Mr. Wright, that you and your client have evidence of this infidelity." He stood up, holding a thick envelope in his hands. "Yes, Your Honor." He handed the envelope to the bailiff, who brought it to me. I looked at Mr. Sullivan. "Why did you first try to get a divorce based on irreconcilable differences, and then decide to give up and move on to infidelity, if you had all the evidence from the very beginning?" "Your Honor, I am not a malicious person. I didn't want the public to know what she did. I offered a fair deal. However, since she decided that she did not want to make a fair deal, I felt that I had no choice but to go this route and publicize what she had done." I looked towards Mrs. Sullivan. "So, lawyer, it's your turn." He got up. "Your Honor, my client has her own evidence that her husband also cheated. She knew that he had been sleeping around for a while now, and that was the only reason she started the affair. We have evidence here." He hands over the evidence to the bailiff so that he can give it to me. It's clear. Taking the envelopes with evidence in my hands, I said, "I'll need some time to think about this. We will meet again in an hour." I banged the gavel, and everyone filed out of the room. I walked into my office and threw the envelopes on the table. I poured myself a glass of cold water from the mini fridge and sat down to get to work. The first thing that caught my eye were photographs. There were dozens of them. They showed Mrs. Sullivan and her lover in various outfits, as well as in various stages of sexual intercourse. I reread the private investigator's report. It seemed that the investigation continued for 3 months. I will never understand why any husband or wife would want to wait that long. It just never made sense to me to put myself through that extra torture. The traders met twice a week in the evenings, once during a banal bachelorette party every week, and of course, obligatory work until late in order to get everything done. There was a video there. I walked over to the sofa and put the DVD into the player. Well, I thought there was nothing better than watching homemade porn at work. I pressed play, and my senses were immediately assaulted by the man's hairy ass on Mrs. Sullivan. They looked like two animals fighting in the wild. There was definitely no love in what the two of them did in that first video. Having finished the fuss, they lay down on the bed. The man asked her, "So your weakling hubby has you as good as I do?" She grinned. "Not even close. I mean, he's not that bad. He's gentle and loving, just not as good and doesn't give me as many peeks as you do." He laughed at this. "Maybe you should turn it off for a while, and it will better show the picture you need. I've already pretty much cut down on sex to once every couple of weeks. Unless, of course, see, he starts whining about it. But lately, he hasn't even bothered to try. In fact, he didn't pay much attention to me or the kids. I have to send them to his parents every time I need to get out of the house." I pressed the stop button. I've heard more than enough of this crap. I hated scammers, I really did. However, nothing angered me more than seeing someone mistreat children, especially when these children are their own. Then I took the time to look at the incriminating evidence on my husband. It was no better than that of my wife. At least she was with one person. Her husband was caught with about 10 different women. He could be heard on the video saying some pretty horrible things about his wife and children that just made my blood boil. I called Mr. Sullivan's parents and asked them to come to court to hear the decision I was about to make. They told me they could be there in 10 minutes. I sat there wondering what I was going to do until the hour break was up. I walked through the doors. Everyone rises. The Honorable Judge Jeffrey Stone is present. I sat down on my chair. Anger boiled inside me, but I maintained my professional appearance the entire time. "You can sit down." I looked around the room and saw the same people, as well as Mr. Sullivan's parents, sitting at the far end of the room. I have reviewed all the evidence presented to me, and I must say that I am shocked by what I have witnessed. At the moment, I cannot come to any decision. There are other factors that need to be taken into account. Nowadays, I have to think about the interests of the children first. I feel that at this time it would be best for them to live with their grandparents. I am granting them temporary custody of both children until this entire matter is resolved. Both lawyers and parents immediately jumped up and began to object. I hit the table quite hard and loudly with the hammer, almost breaking it in half. I will ensure order in the courtroom. This is my decision, and it is final. One more outbreak like this, and you will all be held accountable for contempt of court. Now sit down. I looked at my grandparents at the far end of the room. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, could you please come forward?" They stood up and walked to the front of the room. "At this time, I want the children to be placed with you where they can be safe and happy. Are you happy with this?" They both spoke at the same time. "Of course, Your Honor." Then the grandmother spoke. "Your Honor, we love our grandchildren to death and spend a lot of time with them. We wish they were with us. Then these are my orders. Parents may have supervised visitation for 1 hour per week at your discretion, preferably at different times. However, before this starts, I would like to talk to both children myself. Could you bring them here tomorrow morning to meet me?" "That won't be a problem, Your Honor. We'll have to take them out of school for a while, but I'm sure everything will be fine. They are very smart children and catch up easily," Mrs. Sullivan said. "Then we'll see you tomorrow morning." "The meeting is declared closed," I said, banging the gavel and rising from the bench. I went into my office and sat down at my desk. I looked at the photo of my wife that was on my desk and couldn't help but smile, remembering the first time I saw her back in my senior year of college. As I walked across campus to class with an armful of books in my hands, I tripped over my own feet. Books flew in all directions. I heard giggling and looked up. There she was, the most beautiful girl I had ever seen in my life. She leaned over to help me collect my books and asked if I was okay. I laughed at my own clumsiness and told her I was fine. From that moment, I knew that we were destined to be together. A year later, we got married. I had just passed the bar exams to begin practicing law. Time really flies by. I looked at the photo of the whole family, a son with his wife and children, and a daughter with her husband and children. All things considered, my life turned out to be pretty good. I took the phone and dialed my son's number. It rang several times before a young, shrill voice answered. "Hello, Stone Res, Stonehouse," said a young voice. I couldn't help but laugh. It was my youngest granddaughter, Abby, who answered the phone. "Well, hello, Miss Abby. What are you doing today?" "Grandfather," she squealed with delight. "I miss you, Grandpa." "I miss you too, honey. Have you been a good girl?" "I'm always a good girl, Grandpa," she said matter-of-factly. "Abigail, who's calling, honey?" I heard a woman's voice. It was Caroline, my sister-in-law. "This is Grandpa, Mommy," she said. "Grandpa, do you want to talk to Mom?" "Of course, honey." "Okay, Grandpa, I love you." "I love you too, honey." "Hey, Dad, is everything okay?" asked the daughter-in-law, grabbing the phone. "Caroline, honey, Everything is just fine. I'm just calling to check in and see how you are doing. How are you and the kids doing? What was George up to? It's been a long time since he last called me. I'm fine, Dad. Just got a promotion at work. Both girls are doing great. Abby just started kindergarten, and Sophie started first grade. George was very busy at the firm. Dad, I shouldn't tell you. He wants it to be a surprise, but he's about to be named a partner. This is wonderful, honey. Don't worry, I won't say anything and I'll pretend to be surprised when he tells me. I chuckled. Thank you, Dad. I'm sure he'll like it. Well, honey, I'm still in the office, so now I have to go home. I'll talk to you later. Kiss the children for me. I will do so, Dad. Good night, she replied. I hung up the phone, leaned back in my chair, and took a deep breath, stretching my arms above my head as I prepared to head home. The next morning, I was in my office when there was a knock on the door. The bailiff opened the door. The Sullivan children are here with their grandparents, Your Honor. Oh, yes. Let them in, please. The children and grandparents entered the room. The children were quiet and seemed shy and reserved. I put a smile on my face as they looked at me. Hello and welcome. Please come sit down here on the sofa and let's talk for a while. It's okay, children. The judge just wants to talk to you guys a little, their grandmother said. They walked over to the sofa and sat in the middle, with Grandma and Grandpa sitting on either side of them. Hello? You must be Makala and William, I said. They both nodded their heads. Yes, sir, Your Honor, said the eldest, 10-year-old Makala. Please just call me Jeff. There's no need for Your Honor or anything like that. So tell me, kids, are you guys having fun with your grandparents? Do you enjoy living with them? They nodded their heads. Yes, sir. Grandma bakes cookies for us, William said with a smile. I grinned. This is good. My grandmother always baked cookies for me, too. Say, why don't you guys step away with the officer for a minute? I want to talk to your grandparents alone, and then I'll bring you back so we can chat. Is this not difficult for you? They both nodded and said, okay. I waited while the bailiff led the children into the hall. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, the reason I granted you temporary custody of the children is based on some things I have witnessed and heard, evidence of your daughter-in-law's adultery. This doesn't look good to anyone right now from a children's welfare perspective. Their well-being should be a priority above everything else. Mrs. Sullivan shook her head and said, sobbing, You're right, Jeff. I honestly don't know where we went wrong raising our son. I handed her a box of tissues from my desk. None of this is your fault. Tell me, how often did your children spend time with you before? How often have parents asked you to babysit their children? The sad truth is that the children were with us more than with their parents. We played a much larger role in their upbringing. Most of the time when they weren't working, the parents spent time hanging around the city. Sometimes with each other, sometimes with someone else, Mrs. Sullivan said. Understand. Could you both wait for me in the hall? I'd like to talk to the kids for a bit. Could you please send William to me first? Of course, Mrs. Sullivan said as they stood up and headed for the door. A few seconds later, little William appeared at the door. I looked at him and smiled. Hello, William. Please come and sit down. I'd like to talk to you a little about your mom and dad, if you don't mind. He nodded, came over and sat down on the sofa, and asked, Am I in trouble? So that's why Mom and Dad quarrel all the time. The poor child is only 8 years old, and he is foresaid to bear such a burden from his parents, thinking that it is his fault. I sighed. No, William. You are not in trouble. None of this is your fault. Do you often see Mom and Dad quarreling? He shook his head. Yes, sir. All the time. This really scares me. I try to tell them that I'm scared, but they just yell at me to be quiet and watch TV. Understand? Does your mom or dad ever spend time with you? Play games or read to you before bed? How about at dinner time you all sit down together and eat like a family? No, sir. They always tell me to just go to bed. Usually my sister helps me get ready and puts me to bed for the night. I spend most of my time playing with her, or with my grandparents when we are with them. I sighed. Okay, William, why don't you go out into the hallway to your grandparents? And please ask your sister to come in for a few minutes. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk to me. The boy stood up, smiled at me, and shook my hand. It surprised me to hear this from an 8-year-old boy. You're welcome, sir, and thank you for helping my family. I was speechless at the seriousness this little child had and immediately knew that this must be the work of his grandparents. A few seconds later, Mikala came in and sat down in front of me. Hello, Mikala. I just want to ask you a few questions and then you can go home to your grandparents. Is that okay? Yes, sir. Mikala, do you like living with your grandparents? Yes, very. Grandma lets me help her bake cookies, and Grandpa always helps me with my schoolwork, she said. This is cute. This is what good grandparents should do. Have your mom and dad ever done anything like this with you? She looked so sad when I asked about it. No, sir, they are always too busy. They quarrel with each other all the time or are not at home. Sometimes when I ask for help, they call me bad names and tell me to leave, she said with tears in her eyes. My heart began to ache for the poor child. I immediately understood what needed to be done. Okay, honey, we don't need to talk about this anymore. Why don't you go out and ask your grandparents to come in for a minute? Okay, thank you, sir, she said, standing up and heading towards the door. A few seconds later, my grandparents came in and sat down in front of me. Well, it's pretty clear that neither child likes or wants to be at home with their parents, and I'm inclined not to allow either parent to keep them at this point. For now, they will remain with you until further notice. The court will resume its session soon, and then we will see what we can do. I thanked them for bringing the children and escorted them out. I took the phone from the table, dialed my son's home number, and listened to it ring a couple of times before they pick it up. A male voice answered, "Hello, Stone's residence." "George, son, I'm glad to finally find you at home." "Hi, Dad." "Yes, I'm sorry. I've been very busy the last few weeks. Caroline and Abby told me you called the other day." He laughed. Actually, Abby never stopped talking about it. I let out a chuckle. Such a sweet girl. I miss her, and little Joe too. You know that Mom's birthday's coming soon. You're going to come, aren't you? Both you and your sister. Of course, Dad. I've already talked to Sarah about this. We wouldn't miss this for anything. We'll both be there this weekend, he said. Okay. Then I look forward to meeting you. Kiss and hug my grandchildren for me, and I'll talk to you later.